A single blackened key landed in Sarah Miller's hands before anyone dared step closer. The Duke of Norfolk did not raise his voice. He simply informed the military inspectors that the abandoned Blackwood Smokehouse, along with 200 supposedly diseased pigs, now belonged to her. If even one soldier became sick from the meat produced there, she, not the Duke, would answer for treason. The summer heat already carried the smell of decay across the marshes. The village refused to come near the smokehouse. Salt merchants suddenly claimed they had nothing left to sell. Even clean water had been cut off. Everything suggested she had been handed a public execution disguised as a business. Sarah never argued. Instead, she walked directly toward the weakest pig in the herd and knelt beside it. Within seconds, she noticed one detail every official had overlooked. That single observation would eventually destroy the Duke's most profitable contract. The soot-black key struck Sarah Miller's palm hard enough to leave a crescent in the skin. No one moved when it slipped against her fingers. The military inspectors stood beneath the shade of the carriage awning, their collars damp with summer heat. Two orderlies held the reins of restless horses while marsh flies gathered around their eyes. Lord Arthur Vance remained on the stone step of Blackwood Smokehouse, one gloved hand resting on the head of his cane. "The property is yours from this hour," he said. He did not look at the building when he spoke. He looked at Sarah. The smokehouse rose behind him like a burned watchtower. 6 levels of Elizabethan brick, blackened by grease and neglect. Half the upper vents had been sealed by soot. Rusted iron hooks turned slowly beyond the open doors. Near the eastern wall, broken troughs leaned against a pen containing 200 pigs whose ribs showed through dusty hides. The smell reached across the yard and into the reeds. One inspector covered his mouth with a folded handkerchief. Vance noticed and allowed the smallest pause before continuing. "The Army requires preserved pork before the regiment sails. 4 weeks from today. Miss Miller has assumed Blackwood's stock, equipment, labor obligations, and liability." Sarah closed her fingers around the key. She had assumed nothing willingly. That morning, a clerk from Vance's estate office had placed the transfer deed before her and explained that refusal would be treated as abandonment of debt. Her late father's workshop lease, her cottage, and the few tools left in her name had all been attached to the same account. Sign or lose them before sunset. She had signed because the page offered no honest choice. Vance turned toward Captain Bell, the senior military inspector. "If the meat fails examination, the loss will be charged to Miss Miller. If she distributes flesh from animals declared infected after receiving formal warning, the matter will be referred under military supply law." Bell's gaze shifted toward Sarah. "You understand the accusation that could follow?" She did. The document on his board did not merely transfer animals and equipment. A second paragraph stated that Sarah had accepted the herd after being informed it came from infected ground. If soldiers later fell ill, the sentence would make negligence appear deliberate. "Knowingly endangering the regiment's supply," she said. "And in wartime? Treason, if intent is presumed." The 2 estate clerks beside the carriage became very still. Vance lowered the tip of his cane into the dirt. "Then the matter is clear." A wagon waited near the gate with Sarah's belongings. One trunk, a narrow bedroll, a whetstone, her father's slaughter knife, wrapped in oilcloth, and a wheelbarrow filled with oak sawdust, purchased before the estate merchants received orders not to sell to her. There was no water barrel. She had asked for one. The steward had claimed the pipe from the northern spring was closed for repairs. The ditch beside the road still ran clear beneath the weeds. Sarah looked from the ditch to the dry cistern fixed against the smokehouse wall. Vance did not need to destroy Blackwood himself. Heat, thirst, rumor, and time would do the work more quietly. Captain Bell held out the document board. "I require your signature confirming receipt." Sarah accepted the pen but did not write. The receipt listed 200 pigs and described them as times previously identified as showing signs of contagious disease. No surgeon's name appeared beneath the statement. No date of examination had been entered. The space for the inspecting officer remained blank. "Were you present when the herd was examined?" she asked Bell. "No." "Was any military surgeon present?" "Not to my knowledge." Vance's voice cooled. "Miss Miller, sign the receipt." She wrote her name beneath the count of animals. Then she added one sentence in the margin. No disease examination witnessed. No inspecting surgeon named. The estate clerk leaned forward. You cannot alter an official form. She has not altered the count, Bell said. She has recorded the condition under which she received it. Vance read the note without bending toward the page. The smallest tension appeared beside his mouth. Sarah understood then that the accusation had been prepared before the herd reached Blackwood. If the animals died, if the meat spoiled, or if a soldier became ill from another supplier's batch, the signed declaration was meant to show she had accepted disease stock knowingly. Her note did not free her. It made the trap visible. Vance handed the board back to Bell. If your pork kills soldiers, he said, you will die before they do. He descended the step, passed close enough for Sarah to smell starch and cedar on his coat, and entered the carriage. The inspectors followed. Wheels crushed the dry ruts as the party turned toward the village, leaving Sarah beside the wagon and the animals no one else would touch. For several minutes she listened. The pigs shifted in the pen, chains knocked against warped boards, flies hummed over the troughs. Deep inside the smokehouse, a loose iron hook struck brick at irregular intervals. Thomas Reed stood near the rear gate. He had remained silent throughout the transfer, wearing an old sergeant's coat with the right sleeve pinned neatly above the elbow. Vance's steward had dismissed him from estate work that spring, claiming a one-armed veteran had no place in a slaughter yard. He now held a broom in his remaining hand. You still have time to leave, he said. They would seize the cottage. Cottages can be replaced. Not by someone charged with treason. Thomas considered that, then looked toward the pen. They said the herd has foot disease. They wrote it down, Sarah said. That is not the same as proving it. She took her father's knife from the wagon. She did not unwrap the blade. Instead, she used the polished brass end of the handle to lift the lip of the nearest pig. The animal pulled away, frightened but alert. Its gums were pale, no blisters. She examined the nostrils, then pressed 2 fingers along the jaw and joints. The eyes were clear beneath the dust. The skin above the shoulder settled slowly after pressure. Dehydration. The pig's hooves were cracked, but the flesh around them was unbroken. No raw lesions, no heat at the joints. Its breath carried the bitter green smell of marsh grass, not the sour rot of fever. Sarah crouched lower and studied the mud dried between its toes. A line of white crystals clung there. She touched them with one fingertip, then tasted the smallest trace. Salt. Thomas watched her face. Well, this one is starving, she said, and it has been drinking brackish water. That is not plague. No. Another pig pressed forward, then another. Thin animals, weak animals. Animals neglected long enough to look condemned from a distance, but not diseased. Sarah rose and looked toward Blackwood's dark entrance. The air inside was nearly hot enough to cook meat. The vents were blocked, the hooks unsafe, the floor fouled, the water cut, and every merchant in the county had likely been warned against her. None of that changed what she had just found. The Duke had not handed her a plague herd. He had handed her 200 witnesses and a document prepared to make their condition her crime. Sarah began with the pigs because living problems could not be postponed as easily as broken walls. By noon, she and Thomas had moved the weakest animals into the narrow strip of shade along the western side of the yard. The old troughs leaked through split seams, so Thomas drove wedges cut from a fallen gatepost into the gaps, while Sarah hauled brackish water from the marsh ditch in 2 dented buckets. She disliked using it. The salt would worsen their thirst if she gave them too much, but leaving them dry would kill them sooner. Behind the ruined cooper's shed, she found 3 covered barrels holding old rainwater. It smelled faintly of oak leaves and iron but showed no green film. She strained it through folded linen, mixed it with the ditch water, and marked the inside of every trough with charcoal so each pen received the same measured portion. Thomas watched her move the line on one trough twice. You expect them to understand fairness? No, Sarah said. I expect us to. The pigs drank without the painful swallowing she would have expected from throat lesions. Several rooted at the damp earth after the troughs emptied. One found a clump of sedge beneath the fence and tore at it with sudden energy. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had examined 23 animals. Not one showed the open sores, fever, frothing, or spreading lameness described in the transfer declaration. Their hooves were split from wet ground and neglect. Their shoulders were narrow. Their hides carried lice. 2 had infected scratches from fighting over food. All were weak. Weakness could be repaired. Contagious disease would have required isolation, burning, and a named surgeon's report. Sarah wrote the distinction on the back of her copy of the transfer receipt. Beneath the words she had added before Bell, she entered the number of animals examined, the condition of their mouths and hooves, and the absence of fever. Thomas read over her shoulder. "You think Vance knew?" "I think he knew no one had examined them closely." "That is not the same answer. It is the only one I can prove." She folded the paper and placed it inside the oilcloth wrapping around her father's knife. If Vance intended to turn the declaration into evidence, she would begin building a better record before the first animal died. The smokehouse gave them no such orderly beginning. The main doors resisted until Thomas wedged the broom handle beneath one corner, and Sarah leaned her full weight against the iron ring. The timber dragged across the floor with a grinding sound. A cloud of flies rose from the darkness. Heat struck her face. Inside, Blackwood was hotter than the yard. 6 levels of blackened brick climbed around a hollow central chamber. Chains hung from crossbeams, lost in shadow. The lower hooks were furred with rust, and several had fallen point first into the dirt floor. Grease had hardened along the walls in dark ridges. Near the old cutting table, the remains of a fox lay beneath a collapsed rack. Thomas stepped back. That smell would convict a saint. Sarah tied a strip of linen over her nose and entered. An ordinary observer would have seen filth, heat, and abandonment. Sarah saw separate failures. The dead fox caused the sweetest rot. Stagnant grease produced the rancid heaviness near the cutting table. Wet soot in the northern wall gave off the bitter mineral smell. The flies gathered thickest near the blocked drain, not the upper vents. None of it came from the pigs. She moved slowly, touching nothing she had not first examined. The lower iron racks could not be trusted. The brickwork remained sound except where roots had pushed beneath the eastern wall. The ceiling vents were clogged but not collapsed. A vertical ladder still clung to the inner shaft, though 3 rungs had loosened. The cutting table was ruined. The stone platform beneath it was not. "Save the chains above shoulder height," she said. "Everything lower comes down." Thomas looked at the rusted framework. "With one hand?" "With a rope." "And if the beam gives way?" "Then we learn which part of the floor not to stand on." He gave her a flat look. Sarah almost apologized. Instead, she tied one end of a rope around the nearest rack and showed him how to brace it against a stone pillar. He pulled while she struck the rusted joint with the blunt back of her father's knife. The first rack broke free after 11 blows and fell hard enough to crack a floor tile. The noise rolled upward through the tower. A second sound answered from below. Not an echo. Sarah raised one hand. They listened. A faint draft moved across her ankles, cool enough to lift the damp hair against her skin. It came from beneath the stone platform where the old firebox stood. Thomas crouched and swept away soot with the broom. A narrow iron plate appeared in the floor. Its ring handle had rusted flat. Sarah worked the knife point beneath it, while Thomas held the lamp close. The plate lifted less than an inch before packed ash stopped it. Cool air escaped through the gap. It carried smoke. Not the stale chimney smell trapped in the tower. This was older and cleaner peat, wet earth, and charred oak. Sarah lay flat and brought her cheek near the opening. The draft remained steady. "There is a passage beneath us," Thomas said. "A flue. The chimney is above." Then the smoke was meant to travel sideways before it rose. They spent the next hour clearing the plate. Thomas loosened the ash with a broken hook while Sarah removed it by hand into a bucket. Beneath the first layer lay gray dust. Beneath that, blackened fragments of oak. The plate finally opened onto a brick throat descending at a shallow angle into darkness. Sarah lowered the lamp. The flame leaned away from her. Air was moving through the buried channel, even though no fire burned. She measured the opening with her hand, then touched the brick along its inner edge. The yard had baked beneath the sun all day. but the masonry below remained cool. Her grandmother's curing cellar in Scotland had worked on the same principle, though never at this scale. Smoke entered warm, traveled beneath stone, lost its heat, then rose around fish and pork without cooking them. It dried the surface slowly and discouraged insects. With clean cutting and controlled airflow, it reduced the amount of salt required for preservation. Sarah looked upward into 6 levels of hanging space. The tower was not the fire chamber. It was the cooling chamber. Thomas saw the change in her attention. Can it work? I do not know. It was the first answer he appeared to trust without question. She lowered herself farther and examined the brick throat. Soot had packed the sides nearly shut. Roots crossed the passage. Somewhere deeper inside, water dripped at a slow, regular pace. Clearing it might take days. It might collapse. Even if they opened it, they still lacked clean hooks, sound tables, labor, fuel, and enough fresh water to wash one carcass properly. Outside, one of the pigs struck the pen and squealed for food. Sarah sat back on her heels. Blackwood had not failed because it trapped too much heat. It had failed because someone had abandoned the part designed to remove it. She took the charcoal from her pocket and drew 3 lines on the stone floor: the buried flue, the tower shaft, and the western opening where the smoke should rise. Thomas studied the rough plan. What first? We keep the animals alive tonight. And tomorrow? We clear 20 feet of tunnel. And after that? Sarah looked at the transfer receipt hidden inside the knife wrapping, then at the cool air moving from beneath the floor. We find out whether Blackwood was abandoned because it stopped working or because someone found it more useful, as a ruin. By sunrise, Sarah had reduced Blackwood to 3 immediate tasks. Keep the pigs alive. Open the buried flue. Produce 1 clean piece of meat before rumor became official fact. She wrote the order on a scrap of packing paper and fixed it to the smokehouse door with a bent nail. Thomas read it while finishing the last crust of bread from his pocket. You left out water. That belongs to the first task. And salt? The third. And labor. Sarah looked across the yard. 200 pigs crowded the pens. The weakest lay beneath strips of canvas they had tied between broken posts. The stronger animals had already begun testing the fence with their shoulders. Beyond them, reeds bent over the brackish ditch, and the roofs of the village remained visible through the morning haze. No one had come near Blackwood. Labor belongs to all 3, she said. They began with the flue. The iron opening beneath the fire platform was too narrow for Thomas's shoulders and too unstable for Sarah to enter without testing the brickwork. She tied a lantern to a rope and lowered it into the passage. The flame remained upright for 6 feet, leaned at 12, then vanished behind a packed wall of soot. Thomas looped the rope around his waist and braced beside the opening while Sarah lay flat and reached down with a narrow iron scraper. Each stroke brought back damp ash, root fibers, and flakes of mortar. After an hour, the air stopped moving. Sarah withdrew her arm. The blockage shifted. Better? Worse. Thomas peered into the dark throat. Then we have improved it in the wrong direction. She looked at him. His face remained serious. Sarah took a length of hazel from the broken fence, wrapped one end with oilcloth, and pushed it into the passage. The branch struck resistance, bent, then slid another 2 feet. When she pulled it back, the cloth was wet. Water had collected beneath the yard. That changed the order of work. If they opened the passage carelessly, the trapped runoff might flood the fire channel and cost them several days of drying. If they waited, the animals would continue weakening. Sarah walked outside and studied the slope of the land. The buried flue ran west toward the peat beds. The ground fell gently in that direction. A drainage opening should have existed somewhere along the line. Her grandmother had shown her one beneath a stone curing cellar near Inverness. Sarah had been 11 and impatient with the cold. The old woman had made her sit beside the channel until she could distinguish resin, damp peat, and wet mortar by smell alone. A fire tells you what it touches. Stone tells you where water has been. The memory lasted only as long as the work required. Sarah pressed her palm against the outer bricks near ground level. Most had warmed beneath the sun. One section on the western wall remained dark and cool. Thomas joined her with the shovel. There? Possibly. That is an expensive word. It costs less than digging the whole yard. They removed weeds and uncovered a line of bricks set at a slight angle. Sarah tapped each one with the brass end of the knife handle. The first three answered solidly. The fourth gave a hollow note. Thomas drove the shovel edge into the mortar. The brick came free with a rush of black water. They stepped back as trapped runoff spilled across the yard, carrying soot, beetle shells, and the smell of wet ash. The stream lasted less than a minute. When it stopped, cool air pulled through the opening toward the buried channel. Inside the smokehouse, the lantern flame leaned toward the flue again. It was their first measurable result. Not proof that Blackwood could preserve meat. Proof that one hidden system still functioned. Sarah marked the drain with chalk and covered it with a slatted board to keep rats out. Then she turned back to the pigs. They needed food they could digest quickly. Grain was expensive. Bran moved through mills controlled by Vance. Kitchen refuse might help, but one spoiled load would confirm every story told about the herd. Thomas suggested asking the village. Sarah refused before he finished. They will mix moldy sweepings with the clean scraps. Some will. One sick animal could condemn the whole yard. One starving animal could do the same. She tightened the cloth around her wrist. Thomas waited instead of arguing. The silence forced her to examine what she was protecting. Her standards had kept food safe before. They had also taught her to distrust any hand she had not trained herself. At Blackwood, that instinct could leave 200 animals hungry, while she tried to control every bucket alone. "We set rules," she said at last. "No meat, no mold, no stable sweepings, vegetable peelings, clean whey, bruised fruit, spent grain kept off the floor. And if someone brings the wrong thing, we reject the load." That sounds more useful than rejecting the village. Thomas took the wheelbarrow and left. He returned 3 hours later with Mrs. Hale, the cooper's widow, 2 buckets of whey, a sack of barley husks, and 6 boys who had followed because they had been told Blackwood was full of dying animals. Sarah stopped them at the gate. She made each boy wash his hands in boiled rainwater. She inspected every bucket, rejected 1 basket of moldy turnip tops, and drew a clean boundary beside the feed table. She assigned 2 boys to sorting, 2 to carrying water, 1 to trough marks, and the smallest to watching the rejected pile. The work moved slowly, too slowly. When one boy placed a clean scoop on the wrong side of the chalk line, Sarah stopped everyone and ordered the tool boiled again. The delay cost nearly half an hour. 2 pigs began fighting before their feed reached the second pen. Thomas separated them with a gate board. "You protected the scoop," he said. "You nearly lost an animal." Sarah looked at the blood on one pig's ear. The cut was shallow. The lesson was not. She redrew the workstation so the boys could complete each task without crossing paths, then explained why the line existed instead of simply correcting them when they failed. By evening, the pigs had eaten. Not enough, but evenly. The flue had drained. 20 feet of passage had been cleared. The village had sent the first supplies Blackwood had received without Vance's permission. Sarah then unwrapped her father's knife. The blade was narrow, bright, and maintained with greater care than anything else she owned. She drew it across the whetstone 12 times on each side. Thomas watched from the tower entrance. "You mean to slaughter one already? The smallest healthy animal. That gives us less meat. It gives us less to lose." They selected a young pig with clear eyes and sound feet. Thomas sent the boys beyond the yard before the work began. Sarah boiled the cloths, scrubbed the stone platform, and laid out the knife, rope, bucket, saw, and clean sawdust in exact order. The old hanging beam shifted under the first load. They lowered the carcass, reset the rope around a sounder crosspiece, and began again. By dusk, one trimmed section of pork hung in the lower chamber. Sarah washed it with a light brine made from crystals scraped from the marsh pans, boiled twice, filtered, and weighed. Below, Thomas built a small fire from oak sawdust. Warm smoke entered the buried flue. At the tower opening, it emerged cool enough for Sarah to hold her hand inside it. She watched the first pale stream gather around the meat. One controlled fire. one carefully prepared cut. One night to learn whether Blackwood still remembered what it had been built to do. The first test failed before midnight. Sarah smelled the change from the yard. The oak smoke had begun clean and dry, but now a heavier scent pressed beneath it, the sweet, fatty smell of meat warming too quickly. She crossed the yard with the lamp held low and found Thomas beside the fire mouth, feeding sawdust into the iron pan, one measured handful at a time. "How long since the draft strengthened?" she asked. 10 minutes, perhaps 12. Inside the tower, the pork had begun to shine. A clear bead of fat gathered along the lower edge and fell onto the stone. The smoke surrounding it was no longer cool. Sarah placed the back of her wrist beneath the hanging cut and pulled away. "Too warm. Smother the fire." Thomas covered the sawdust with damp peat, while Sarah cut down the meat before the center could cook unevenly. The outer surface had tightened, but the lower end was soft and greasy. It would not keep. They carried it to the cutting platform. Sarah sliced through the center. A gray line showed beneath the smoked surface, deeper on the western side. The heat had penetrated unevenly. Thomas examined it under the lamp. "Can we save any?" "For supper, not for inspection." They had spent one healthy animal, half their clean water, and most of the first basket of oak sawdust to produce nothing they could place before a surgeon. Sarah looked upward. The buried flue had cooled the smoke. The tower had failed to distribute it. She took the lamp and climbed the inner ladder before Thomas could object. At the second level, soot had narrowed the eastern vents to finger-width gaps. 2 western shutters stood open where their hinges had broken, drawing the rising smoke toward one wall. Higher still, a fallen chain had lodged across a vent plate and held it half closed. The fire had not been too large. The draft had been crooked. Sarah descended with soot streaked across her sleeves. "We clear the eastern vents and close the western gaps." "With what?" "The old door planks. They are warped. So are the openings." They worked until dawn. Thomas used a rope looped around his shoulder to raise short lengths of timber, while Sarah fixed them across the broken shutters with salvaged nails. She climbed each level with a hooked scraper, knocking packed soot into buckets below. Twice, rusted fittings broke under her hand. Once, a ladder rung pulled free and struck the floor beside Thomas. He looked up. "You said we would learn where not to stand." "We have. That answer improves nothing. It improves where you stand next time." By morning, both of them were too tired to argue well. The 6 boys returned after breakfast, accompanied by Mrs. Hale and a carpenter named Amos Pike. Pike had refused estate work since Vance's steward withheld payment for a barn roof the previous winter. He carried a brace, 2 chisels, and the expression of a man expecting Blackwood to collapse before he finished measuring it. Sarah showed him the hanging beam. "I need it to hold 1 carcass today and 6 by the end of the week." Pike pressed a thumb into the split timber. "You need a new beam. I need this one reinforced." "That is not the same thing." "No, it is what we can afford." He examined the supports and measured the sound wood with a length of knotted cord. The middle section had rotted where steam once gathered, but the ends remained strong. "I can sister 2 lengths of ash along the sides," he said. "Iron straps around the center. It will carry weight, but not carelessness." Sarah offered him no coin. She offered a share of every successful batch until the debt was paid. Pike glanced toward the failed pork cooling on the table. "From that?" "Not from that." His mouth moved slightly. "Then I had better help you improve." The work divided into 3 stations. Pike reinforced the beam. Thomas reset the lower draft. Sarah cleared the upper vents and assigned the boys to carry soot, water, boards, and clean cloths. At first, she inspected every movement. She stopped one boy because his bucket had touched the yard wall. She made another rewash, a rope after its loose end, brushed the floor. When Daniel placed a scrub brush on the wrong side of the chalk line, she halted the entire room. The delay spread outward. The fire pan remained unprepared. Pike waited for 2 boys who were still boiling tools. One pig knocked open a weak pen rail while Thomas was inside helping Sarah reset the washing station. By the time they forced the animal back, the repaired beam had stood unused for nearly an hour. Thomas closed the gate with his shoulder. "You are protecting every object," he said, breathing hard. You are not protecting the work. A dirty brush can spoil meat. So can a crew that cannot move without your permission. Sarah looked toward the boys. Daniel stood beside the basin, holding the brush without knowing whether he was still allowed to use it. The others watched Sarah instead of their stations. She had taught them to fear mistakes. She had not yet taught them how to prevent one. Sarah took the chalk and redrew the floor. Instead of one boundary, she marked a clear route from washing to cutting to hanging. She gave each station its own bucket, cloth, hook, and tool board. Then she explained the risk attached to every line. Dirty water carried flies. Raw waste contaminated clean surfaces. A misplaced hook could carry blood back toward finished meat. Daniel received responsibility for the clean boundary. If anyone crosses with an unwashed tool, Sarah said, you stop them. Anyone? Anyone. Thomas looked at her. She added, including me. The boys returned to work. They moved more slowly for the first half hour, then faster than before because no one waited for Sarah to approve every step. By noon, the reinforced beam held Thomas's full weight and 2 sacks of wet sand. Pike marked the deflection against the wall with chalk. Less than half an inch. A measured result. Sarah allowed 6 boys into the tower. Daniel stopped Pike when one chisel crossed the boundary after falling outside. Pike washed it without complaint. That afternoon, they prepared a second cut. Sarah reduced the fire pan to half its former depth. Thomas mixed the oak sawdust with dry peat so it would smolder longer at lower heat. Pike fixed a narrow tin strip beside the lower vent. Sarah rubbed beeswax onto 4 marked points. If any wax softens, she said, the smoke is too warm. They hung the meat higher and farther from the western wall. The upper shutters remained partly closed. The eastern vents stood clear. For 3 hours, the wax held. The smoke rose through the tower in an even column. No fat appeared on the pork. Its surface dried from wet pink to a firm dark red. When Sarah pressed it with 2 fingers, the flesh yielded slightly and returned to shape. At sunset, Mrs. Hale appeared in the doorway with an empty basket. My sister's husband has a chest complaint, she said. He cannot keep fresh pork in this heat. The cut is not finished. I know. You came to buy something that may still fail? I came because the village can smell that this one has not. Sarah looked toward Thomas. He said nothing. She cut a narrow strip from the driest edge, wrapped it in clean cloth, and placed it in Mrs. Hale's basket. Boil it before serving. Return tomorrow and tell me its smell, its texture, and whether he keeps it down. Mrs. Hale placed 3 small coins on the table. For the next piece, she said. Sarah almost returned them. The test had not passed a full night. The cut had not been inspected. Taking payment felt too close to claiming certainty before the evidence existed. Then she remembered the empty troughs, Pike's unpaid labor, and the boys carrying water while she inspected every line. She left the coins where they were. They would not buy salt or replace the wasted sawdust. They were still the first money Blackwood had earned. After Mrs. Hale left, Thomas opened the fire mouth and checked the peat mixture without asking Sarah to stand beside him. Daniel walked the chalk line. Pike measured the beam a second time. The boys changed the wash water when the marked level fell. The work continued without waiting for her hands. Sarah stood beneath the hanging cut and watched the wax points remain solid. By morning, they would know whether the meat had survived the night. They would also know whether Blackwood's first working system could survive an hour without Sarah controlling every part of it. Mrs. Hale returned before breakfast with the cloth folded into a square and the 3 coins still missing from her purse. My husband ate all of it, she said. He said it tasted of oak and salt, but not enough salt to burn his mouth. He slept through the night. Sarah took the cloth and smelled it before placing it in the wash basin. No sourness, no sweet rot, only boiled pork, smoke, and the faint soap Mrs. Hale used on her hands. Did the meat soften in the pot? After an hour. Any gray grease on the water? Clear. Any sickness afterward? None. Sarah wrote each answer beneath the date on the back of her working record. It was not a medical judgment. It did not prove the process would hold through a voyage or survive several weeks in summer heat. but it was an outside observation from someone who had no reason to protect Blackwood. By noon, 3 more villagers stood outside the gate. None entered without being asked. A dairywoman brought whey. A baker's apprentice carried 2 sacks of clean bran swept into cloth before they touched the floor. The third visitor was a butcher, who refused to give his name. He left a bundle of sharpened hooks beneath the fence, after checking twice that no one from Vance's estate had followed him. Rumor had not disappeared. It had divided. Some still said Blackwood spread disease. Others had begun saying its smoke smelled cleaner than the Duke's curing sheds. Sarah trusted neither version. She trusted what could be repeated. For the next 4 days, Blackwood worked in measured batches. Only 3 pigs were slaughtered. Sarah would not increase the number until the first cuts held their weight, color, and smell through repeated inspection. Pike reinforced a second beam. Thomas divided the interior into dirty, washing, cutting, and hanging zones with white chalk. The boys recorded every bucket of water, and every hour the fire remained lit. Sarah weighed each cut before smoking, and again every morning. The first lost 9 ounces in 2 days. The second lost 11. The third, hung too near the north wall, lost only 5, and developed a damp patch along one edge. Sarah removed it from the batch, cut away the affected surface, and used the safe portion for the workers' supper. She entered the failure in the record. A process that concealed mistakes would become another version of Vance's contract. On the 5th morning, a military surgeon arrived in a light carriage. Dr. Elias Ward was younger than Sarah expected, and wore his authority as though the coat had been fitted for a broader man. He stepped down with a leather case in one hand and remained outside the gate until Thomas opened it. "I was told there were infected animals here." "There are underfed animals here," Sarah said. "I was told meat was distributed. 1 test portion was provided for household use after boiling. Without military inspection. There was no military inspector willing to come." Ward looked toward the tower. Pale smoke rose from the upper vents in a narrow, even line. "I am here now." Sarah led him first to the pens. Ward selected 10 animals himself. He checked mouths, hooves, joints, eyes, temperature, and breathing. 1 pig had a fever from an infected shoulder wound and was marked for isolation. The others showed parasites, dehydration, and prolonged malnutrition. "No vesicles," he said. "No. No spreading lameness." "No. Who declared the herd contagious?" That question was left blank on the transfer form. Thomas brought the document board. Ward read Sarah's marginal note, then checked the empty space, where an inspecting surgeon's name should have appeared. He did not comment. He copied the wording into his own notebook. Inside the smokehouse, Ward inspected the work areas before touching the meat. He checked the boiling basin, the covered hooks, the knife cloths, and the chalk boundaries. When he reached the clean line, Daniel raised the scrub brush. "You must wash first, sir." Ward looked at Sarah. "He stops everyone," she said. The surgeon washed. The oldest finished cut hung alone in the lower chamber. Its surface was dry and dark red with no oily shine. Sarah placed it on the stone table and handed Ward a clean knife. "You cut it." He sliced through the center. The interior remained firm, evenly colored, and cool. No green ring marked the bone. No moisture pocket opened beneath the surface. Ward smelled the blade, then the meat. "How much salt?" Sarah showed him the measured crystals, starting weight, smoking hours, wax marks, vent position, and daily losses. He studied the figures longer than he studied her. "You used less than half the ordinary cure. Less than 1/3. That should not be sufficient in this heat. It would not be sufficient if the meat remained wet." She showed him the buried flue, the drainage opening, the fire pan, and the 4 beeswax points. She explained no more than each object could demonstrate. Warm smoke entered below. Cool smoke rose above. Moisture left the meat without cooking it. Ward cut 2 samples. He sealed one in a glass jar and wrapped the other in waxed cloth. Before leaving, he placed both inside a narrow military crate painted with the depot code R17. Thomas studied the mark. "That is a receiving code," he said. "The regiment used the same system overseas. Letter for the contractor, number for the delivery." Ward looked at him. You remember supply marks? I remember what happened when men did not. Sarah copied the code beside the batch entry. Ward pressed a red medical seal across the crate cord and wrote the collection hour beneath it. 3 days later, he returned with Captain Bell. This time, both men entered the gate without covering their mouths. Bell carried a folded certificate bearing the regimental surgeon's seal. The sample showed no putrefaction, Ward said. No visible parasite contamination. No evidence consistent with contagious slaughter stock. Sarah accepted the page and read every line. Bell looked toward the tower. How much can you produce before the regiment sails? Not enough yet. His eyebrows rose. Most people facing a military contract would have offered a larger number. Sarah turned the certificate over and wrote on the blank side. With 2 additional sound beams, 6 trained cutters, steady water access, and fuel, Blackwood can deliver 1,200 pounds before departure. Bell read the figure. Can you prove it? I can prove what we produced this week. The rest depends on materials and labor. At the regimental depot that afternoon, Bell allowed Sarah to observe the sample receipt from outside the inspection rail. Ward's crate carried the red medical seal and code R17. Crates supplied under Vance's contract bore a black crown above the letter V. Thomas pointed to the marks without crossing the rail. The crown identifies the contractor. The number identifies the delivery. If either changes, someone has changed the history of the crate. Sarah entered both systems in the Blackwood record. Vance's painted mark identified his supply. Ward's red seal identified the examiner. The depot code identified the shipment at collection. A crate might be moved. Those 3 marks would show whether it had been changed. A mounted estate messenger watched Bell fold the certificate and place it inside his coat. By sunset, the Duke knew Blackwood had passed its first official examination. The next morning, Amos Pike arrived without timber. The butcher's hooks did not come. The baker's apprentice was turned back at the village bridge. Every sawmill, cooper, and wood merchant within 12 miles had received the same written order. No oak boards, oak shavings, or oak sawdust were to be sold, gifted, or carried to Blackwood Smokehouse. Thomas placed the copied notice beside the new certificate. He heard about the result. Sarah counted the remaining fuel. 3 baskets of oak sawdust. Enough for 2 full batches. Perhaps 3, if they weakened the smoke and risked the meat. The first official proof had not opened the market. It had shown the Duke exactly which supply to cut next. The order against oak reached Blackwood faster than any honest supply had. By noon, even Mrs. Hale had been warned that carrying a basket of shavings across the bridge could cost her household its tenancy. Amos Pike sent word that 2 estate men had searched his yard. The butcher who had left hooks beneath the fence did not return. Sarah counted the remaining fuel herself. 3 baskets of oak sawdust, 1 sack of dry peat, a broken cartwheel too tarred for clean smoke. Enough for 2 full batches, or 4 weak ones that might fail before inspection. Thomas watched her divide the piles. We can burn less. We can produce less. That may be better than producing nothing, not with 1,200 pounds promised. He looked toward the certificate pinned above the cutting table. Sarah had written the number because the tower, labor, and cooling flue made it possible. Now the figure stood as a measure of how precisely Vance understood Blackwood's weakness. She walked the smokehouse from top to bottom, checking every vent, joint, draft plate, and wax mark. The answer was not hidden in the upper walls. They had already found what the building could do. The problem was what it consumed. At the western drainage opening, Sarah knelt and held a lamp near the buried flue. Cool air drew the flame inward. Beneath the scent of old oak remained something darker earth, old roots, and the faint sweetness of peat. She looked beyond the yard toward the black cuts in the marsh where local families had dried fuel for generations. Peat burned cooler than oak and lasted longer. It also carried risks. Damp blocks could produce bitter smoke. Surface peat held roots and sedge. Poorly dried fuel could coat meat with tar instead of preserving it. Thomas followed her gaze. You mean to smoke pork with bog fuel? I mean to test what the builders placed beside the flue. They began with the dry stacks behind Mrs. Hale's shed. Sarah broke each block apart, and rejected anything that smelled of standing water, mold, or grass root. The acceptable pieces were dark, light in the hand, and dry enough to crumble at the edge. She mixed 1 part oak sawdust with 3 parts peat. The first test burned too slowly. Smoke thickened inside the fire throat and left black residue on the tin strip. For the second, Thomas opened the lower draft by ½ an inch. The mixture smoldered evenly, but carried a medicinal bitterness that remained on Sarah's tongue. She cut down the exposed strip of meat and entered the failure in the batch record. By the third test, less than 1 basket of oak remained. Thomas sat beside the fire mouth, rubbing his shoulder where the rope harness had cut through his shirt. "We stop now. We preserve enough oak for 1 clean batch, and lose a day. We have already lost 2 strips and half the fuel." Sarah looked at the failed pieces on the cutting table. Each represented an animal: boiled water, labor, time, and trust. Her instinct was to continue until the variables obeyed her. That instinct had protected clean work before. Here, it could consume the last material capable of producing proof. She closed the lower draft. "Let the fire die." Thomas nodded once. He did not praise the decision. That made it easier to accept. At dawn, Sarah returned to the peat stacks with a cup of hot water and 3 cloth packets. She shaved a small amount from each rejected pile, steeped the pieces separately, then smelled the water. The strongest bitterness came from peat cut near the surface. The older black blocks from deeper layers produced a softer odor, with less resin and almost no grass. Depth mattered. She and Thomas opened an abandoned peat cut west of the smokehouse. The upper layer was wet and fibrous. Beneath it lay dense black fuel that broke cleanly under Pike's borrowed spade. Removing it cost most of the morning. Using it might cost another animal. Sarah chose a single small carcass. She trimmed the meat thinner than before to reduce smoking time. She applied only a light measure of boiled marsh salt, then weighed every piece and marked its position in the tower. The fire mixture contained 1 handful of oak for every 4 of deep-cut peat. For 8 hours the wax remained firm. The smoke rose pale blue rather than black. It smelled of dry earth and wood, not bitterness. At the 6th hour, Sarah cut 1 narrow test strip. The surface was firm. No tar marked the edge. The interior remained cool. By the following morning, the meat had lost nearly the same weight as the oak-smoked batch, while using less than 1/4 of the oak. Thomas calculated the result twice. With the peat we can cut nearby, the remaining sawdust lasts nearly 2 weeks. Longer if oak is used only for ignition and balance. And the Duke cannot stop the marsh. He can stop people from helping us cut it. That problem arrived before noon. 2 families who had agreed to bring peat sent word that Vance's steward had threatened their winter grazing rights. 3 men who had worked the western cut stayed home. Sarah looked at the black fuel stacked beside the fire mouth. The material existed. The labor did not. Mrs. Hale proposed paying families with cured meat. Sarah refused immediately. The army shipment must come first. "And what do their children eat while producing it?" Mrs. Hale asked. The question stopped the room. Sarah had treated every pound as evidence against Vance. She had not considered what kind of system would be built if Blackwood reached the target by asking hungry families to wait for justice. She changed the allocation. 1 pound in every 20 would be reserved as food wages until the army released payment. The deduction reduced the projected shipment. It also brought 6 workers back that afternoon and 3 new peat cutters by nightfall. Thomas adjusted the production board. "We lose 60 pounds if we keep the ratio. We gain enough labor to produce more than 60. That evening, Blackwood ran 2 fires. The next morning, 1 failed. The second fire crew had used a surface block without recognizing the sedge fibers. The smoke darkened, and 1 rack developed a bitter edge before Daniel noticed the wax near the lower vent had softened. Sarah ordered the rack removed. The loss was small. The cause was not. Until that moment, the process still depended on her senses. Thomas understood discipline. Pike understood timber. Mrs. Hale understood supplies. But no one else could yet judge peat the way Sarah did. A skill held by 1 person could be silenced. A system repeated by 10 people was harder to bury. She stopped slaughter for half a day. The decision cost output, but continuing would have cost repeatability. Sarah laid 5 peat samples on the table. Wet surface cut, dry surface cut, deep black peat, root-heavy peat, and acceptable fuel. She made the workers break them, smell them, weigh them, and watch how each one smoldered in a small iron cup. Thomas wrote the rejection standard on the wall. Surface roots, reject. Water smell, reject. Green fiber, reject. Soft black block with clean break, accept. 1 part oak to 4 parts deep peat. Draft width fixed to the iron mark. Daniel tested the next crew without Sarah present. They rejected 3 bad blocks and built a clean fire. Pike signed the fuel sheet. Thomas signed beneath him. Mrs. Hale entered the amount delivered. Sarah did not touch the pan. The batch passed. By the end of the week, 6 cuts hung in steady smoke. The pigs were gaining weight. Water loss had fallen because the boys now followed marked washing quantities. The tower operated through the night without Sarah standing beside every fire. Then Captain Bell arrived with a sealed army order. The regiment's sailing date had not changed. 4 weeks remained from the day Vance threw Sarah the key. The board had advanced the inspection schedule. Because formal complaints had been filed against Blackwood, half the promised shipment had to reach the regimental depot within 7 days. The remaining weight would be examined at Blackwood immediately before departure. Sarah read the order twice. The final deadline remained the same. The work had been divided into 2 battles. They could not meet the new requirement by slaughtering faster. More carcasses would only crowd the rails, increase washing demand, and place inexperienced hands inside the clean zone. Thomas waited beside the production board. "We add a night shift," he said. "We add a second trained fire crew. We already have one. We have people copying instructions. That is not the same as people responsible for the result." Sarah assigned authority in writing. Thomas could reject any fuel load or stop any fire. Pike controlled beams, rails, and hook weight. Mrs. Hale controlled supply entry, wage allocation, and food credit. Daniel controlled the clean boundary, regardless of rank. Sarah kept only the final release of meat. That night, a new batch entered the tower without her touching the scale, the rail, or the fire pan. Thomas called the times. Mrs. Hale checked the tags. Daniel stopped a peat cutter carrying a dirty rope across the white line. Pike tested the loaded beam. At dawn, Sarah inspected the meat. The weight loss matched her own batches. The wax held. The smoke remained clean. For the first time, Blackwood's process belonged to more than Sarah's hands. That made the intermediate delivery possible. It also made the smokehouse dangerous to anyone who believed removing one woman would end the work. The advanced inspection changed Blackwood from a workshop into a campaign. Thomas reorganized the yard before sunrise. 1 crew fed and watered the pigs. 1 cleaned knives, hooks, tables, and basins. 2 men cut deep peat from the western bed, while 3 boys turned the blocks on raised wicker screens. Pike completed a 3rd hanging beam with ash braces and iron straps taken from a broken wagon. Sarah assigned every task a time, a place, and a mark on paper. Until then, the records had served her memory. Now they had to survive her absence. Each animal received a number before slaughter. Each cut was weighed at the table, marked with a small bone tag, and entered beside the hour it entered the tower. Fire crews recorded the peat mixture, draft width, and condition of all 4 wax points. Hanging crews noted position, surface color, and daily weight loss. Thomas examined the first completed sheet. "You expect an inspector to read all this? I expect him to understand that another person can." The system slowed them at first. A boy reversed 2 bone tags and forced Sarah to hold both cuts aside until their weights could be matched against the cutting notes. 1 fire crew forgot to record a draft adjustment and spent half an hour rebuilding the sequence from the wax marks. Mrs. Hale protested that 3 signatures were excessive for a single basket of salt. Sarah kept every step. Speed without identity would give Vance exactly what he needed. 1 doubtful cut inside a large shipment, and no reliable way to prove where it had been handled. By the 3rd day, the record saved more time than they consumed. Thomas identified a damp section of the north wall by comparing 5 cuts hung in the same position. Pike moved the rail 18 inches toward the center. The next batch dried evenly. The number on the production board rose from 300 pounds to 580. Then 740. Blackwood no longer smelled abandoned. It smelled of peat, oak, boiled cloth, clean iron, and concentrated labor. People who had once crossed the road to avoid the smokehouse now waited outside the gate for assignments. That was when the first official complaint arrived. The parish constable delivered it in company with 2 estate officers. The paper accused Blackwood of employing unlicensed slaughter labor, spreading livestock disease through the marsh, and contaminating public water with blood waste. Sarah read the charges beneath the open tower door. Behind her, the work stopped. The senior estate officer, Mr. Vale, wore a pale summer coat and held his gloves in one hand. "We will inspect every room, pen, drain, and record," he said. "You may wash first." His gaze hardened. "I represent the Duke. You are entering a clean work zone." Thomas placed a basin on the table between them. Vale appeared ready to refuse. Then he noticed the constable watching and dipped his hands into the boiled water. Sarah allowed no one to wander alone. She showed the isolation pen, including the pig Ward had marked for a shoulder infection. She showed the covered refuse trenched downhill from the rain barrels. She showed the drainage channels lined with ash and lime, the boiled knives, the sealed samples, and the chalk boundaries. Vale lifted one hanging cut and turned its bone tag over. "What does this number prove?" Sarah opened the matching page. "Animal 72, slaughtered Monday at 6:20, starting weight 38 pounds, 4 parts deep peat to 1 part oak, 14 smoking hours, north rail, 3rd level, inspected twice by Thomas Reed and once by me. You wrote the record yourself. 3 people signed it. People in your employ. Choose another cut." Vale selected one from the upper chamber. Sarah did not touch it. Thomas brought the corresponding page. Mrs. Hale brought the scale. The recorded morning weight differed by less than 1 ounce. The constable looked from the balance to the paper. Vale chose a second cut. The result held. He closed the batch book harder than necessary. Outside, one of the estate men spoke quietly to 2 workers near the peat screens. By evening, both had left. The following morning, 4 more failed to arrive. Vance's steward had visited their cottages after dark. Families who continued working at Blackwood would lose grazing rights, firewood access, rent extensions, or the use of estate carts before winter. Sarah stood beside the unfinished batch and counted the missing hands. They could maintain cleanliness with fewer workers. They could not meet the army weight. Thomas proposed hiring labor beyond the estate boundary. The nearest independent village stood 9 miles away. Transport alone would consume money Blackwood did not possess. Mrs. Hale proposed paying workers with finished meat. Sarah refused. The army shipment must be filled first. "And what do their children eat while they fill it?" Mrs. Hale asked. The question remained in the cutting room after everyone became silent. Sarah looked at the 740 pounds marked on the wall. She had treated every ounce as proof against Vance, but proof produced by hungry people would recreate his system beneath a cleaner name. She changed the allocation. 1 pound in every 20 would remain at Blackwood as food wages until the army released payment. Every portion would be entered by worker, household, and batch number. The decision reduced the amount available for inspection. It also brought 9 workers back by afternoon and 3 new peat cutters by nightfall. Thomas adjusted the projection. "We lose 40 pounds from the first delivery. We gain enough hands to produce 80. The next 2 days gave Blackwood its highest output. Work began before sunrise and continued under shielded lamps after dark. Thomas rotated crews before fatigue made them careless. Pike checked beam deflection at every change of shift. Daniel stopped a military orderly who entered with mud on his boots and made him wash like everyone else. Sarah no longer corrected every hand. She checked the points where failure could pass unnoticed. Weights, tags, fuel, temperature, time. The intermediate shipment reached 800 pounds on the 6th morning. Captain Bell sent 2 army wagons to collect it. Before the first crate left the yard, Thomas recorded 4 separate marks. Inside the waxed packet were the Blackwood batch numbers and the individual bone tag list. Across the cord sat Ward's red medical seal. On the outer board appeared the depot receiving code. Across the lid and side frame, Pike cut one shallow diagonal line. The cut was not decorative. If a lid was removed and replaced, the line would no longer meet. The wagon driver signed the road copy. Thomas signed beneath him. Bell's corporal added the departure hour and crate count. Sarah kept one duplicate at Blackwood. A second copy traveled inside Bell's dispatch case, rather than on the meat wagon. The first wagon crossed the village bridge shortly after dawn. The second never reached it. Estate officers stopped the team at the Western Road under an emergency order signed by the county magistrate. The shipment was declared suspect and taken to Vance's old malt store pending investigation of the disease complaint. Thomas returned on foot with the driver shortly before noon. Dust covered the man's coat. He carried the unsigned delivery paper in one hand. "They unloaded your crates first," he said. Then 2 more wagons entered from the south yard. "What marks?" Thomas asked. "Black crown over a V." Sarah looked at him. "Vance's contract mark." "Were those crates placed in the same building?" she asked. "Yes." "Before or after the storehouse was sealed?" "Before. Vale ordered us outside. Then he closed the doors himself." "Were the vents open?" The driver hesitated. "They were until an estate man covered them with sacking." Sarah placed the road copy on the cutting table and wrote the statement beneath the departure record. She made the driver read it before signing. The intermediate deadline had forced Blackwood to move meat before the final inspection. Vance had used that movement to place 2 contractors' goods beneath one locked roof. If the storehouse damaged everything inside, he could claim no one knew which supplier had failed. Unless the marks held. Sarah opened the batch cupboard and removed the matching retained samples. 1 from every 100 pounds. Each wrapped, sealed, tagged, and stored above the cool mouth of the buried flue. Thomas watched her place them in order. "The meat in the malt store may spoil. The samples here will not. That proves ours was sound when it left. It proves that only if the crate marks still tell the truth." Outside, the remaining fires continued to burn. Inside, Sarah copied the shipment history onto a second sheet. Vance controlled the magistrate, the road, and the sealed building. But Blackwood had recorded the meat before he touched it. The question was whether he had understood that every crate now carried a history he could no longer erase simply by closing a door. The detained shipment began to fail before anyone opened the doors. Sarah knew it from the weather. By noon, the wind had dropped. Heat settled over the marsh in a white haze and pressed against the walls of Vance's old malt store. The building had been designed to hold dry grain through winter. Its shutters were narrow, its roof trapped warmth, and its floor stood above a drainage ditch no one had cleared in years. 3 days inside would not merely delay the pork. It would change the evidence. Captain Bell sent no answer to Sarah's first message. The magistrate's clerk returned the second unopened. "Doctor." Ward was permitted to inspect only in the presence of Vance's steward, and Vale claimed he could not attend until the following afternoon. Thomas read the notice beside the cutting table. "They are waiting for the meat to condemn itself." "Yes." "Then we break the seal and give them the crime before they produce the spoilage." The workers around them continued moving, but every sound had changed. Knives struck the table more softly. Peat was measured twice. No one spoke above a murmur. Blackwood still operated. Confidence did not. Mrs. Hale placed the wage ledger before Sarah. "There is enough food credit for 2 more days. After that, some families must choose between Blackwood and paid harvest work." Sarah examined the figures. The army had not paid for the detained shipment. Their rainwater stores were falling. 3 pigs had developed coughs from crowding, though none carried fever. If she continued slaughtering, she might produce meat with no safe road to market. If she stopped, the workers would scatter, and the remaining animals would consume the last feed. There was no clean answer. She reduced the tower to 1 operating fire and halted new slaughter after the current batch. Output fell by half. 1 peat cutter left before sunset. 2 boys did not return the next morning. Pike stood beneath the unused upper rails, and asked whether he should remove them before the damp reached the new straps. No. Then give me a reason to leave them standing. Sarah looked toward the closed record cupboard. Because the first shipment has not failed yet. Pike followed her gaze. It is leaking grease through the floor. The storehouse is failing. That is not the same thing. After dark, Sarah opened the cupboard containing the retained samples. Ward had taken one piece from every 100 pounds. Blackwood had kept matching samples, each wrapped in waxed cloth, marked with the original bone tag, and stored above the cool mouth of the buried flue. She laid them across the stone table in shipment order. 8 samples. 8 matching records. Thomas understood before she spoke. The meat in the storehouse may spoil. These have not. That proves our batch was sound when it left. It proves what remained here was sound. Vance will say I kept the best cuts. Mrs. Hale brought the scales. They worked through the night. Each retained sample was weighed against its last recorded measure. Thomas checked the seals. Pike witnessed the bone tags. Mrs. Hale copied the figures onto a second sheet. The changes remained within the expected drying range. No swelling. No wet surface. No sour odor. The samples were sound. Sarah then placed Thomas's road copy beside them. Blackwood's batch list. Ward's red medical seals. The depot receiving codes. Pike's diagonal lid marks. And beneath those records, the driver's statement that Vance's black-crowned crates had entered the same building before Vale sealed the doors. They did not need to open the storehouse themselves. They needed the opening to occur before witnesses. At dawn, Sarah went to the malt yard with Thomas, Ward, Pike, Mrs. Hale, and the wagon driver. Vale was already waiting beside the gate. "You have no authority here," he said. "I have liability for goods held in that building. You surrendered custody on the road. I surrendered the crates. I did not surrender their history." She did not ask to enter. She walked around the exterior instead. Fresh sacking covered the lower vents. New nails held the southern shutters closed. Beneath the rear wall, dark liquid had begun dripping from the drainage channel. Sarah pressed a clean linen strip against it. Grease. Not blood. Not rainwater. Rendered fat had softened inside the building and escaped through the floor. Ward smelled the cloth. "The room is overheating." Vale folded his arms. "That is speculation." Pike fixed a narrow strip of beeswax to the shaded wall beside the blocked vent. No fire burned nearby. Within minutes, the lower edge softened. "The room is warmer than Blackwood's active smoking chamber," Sarah said. Vale's face remained still. His attention moved toward the road. Captain Bell was approaching with 4 soldiers and the magistrate behind him. The sealed doors were opened publicly. Heat rolled out first. Then the smell. Several lower crates had begun to sweat. Their waxed batch packets were damp but readable. The worst damage appeared along the closed southern wall, where no air could move. Ward examined the first Blackwood lid. Pike's diagonal cut still met across the frame. The second did not. Someone had removed and replaced the lid after the wagon left Blackwood. Thomas placed the road copy beside it. Ward compared the depot code, the red medical seal, and the recorded batch numbers. The outer markings belonged to Blackwood. 2 cuts inside carried no bone tags. Their weights matched nothing in Sarah's records. Bell ordered the neighboring crate opened. A black crown and the letter V remained visible beneath fresh paint. Inside lay heavily salted pork, packed without individual marks. One delivery number had been crossed out and replaced with a number copied from Blackwood's detained shipment. The wagon driver repeated what he had seen. Vance's crates had entered from the south yard. Vale had cleared the building. The vents had been covered. The doors had then been sealed. Sarah opened one retained Blackwood sample under Ward's observation. The pork remained dry, firm, and cool. Ward cut one untagged piece from the altered crate. The surface was hard with salt. Near the bone, the flesh had softened and turned sour. "These are not the same process," he said. "They are not the same supplier," Thomas answered. Bell ordered the storehouse office searched. A clerk found revised crate lists, unused Blackwood labels, and a copy of the detention instruction. In the margin, beside Vale's order to place all disputed meat in the southern room, one sentence had been written in a narrow, controlled hand. Hold ventilation closed until joint examination. Loss. To be charged against Blackwood transfer liability. A. V. Sarah recognized the downstrokes from the transfer deed. Bell compared the writing with Vance's signed payment orders. Vale moved toward the yard gate. A soldier stepped into his path. The instruction did not merely show that Vance knew the storehouse was closed. It showed why he wanted the heat to build. Blackwood's meat had been detained so that spoilage could be manufactured after the shipment left Sarah's control. The mixed crates ensured Vance's inferior pork could be hidden beneath her marks. The original declaration was waiting to convert that spoilage into proof that she had knowingly supplied diseased meat. Sarah placed her transfer receipt beside the instruction. Her marginal sentence remained clear. No disease examination witnessed. No inspecting surgeon named. The first paper had prepared the accusation. The second had prepared the failure. Between them lay Blackwood's records, samples, seals, and witnesses. Bell ordered the storehouse closed again, this time under military guard. Then, he turned toward Sarah. The board will inspect Blackwood publicly tomorrow. The detained shipment had cost them money, labor, and trust. The upper tower stood half empty. Several workers had already left, but the seal Vance had placed over the storehouse no longer held Blackwood's defeat inside. It held his instructions. The public inspection began at 7 the next morning. Captain Bell chose Blackwood, rather than the regimental depot, because no one could claim Sarah had arranged the conditions after the fact. The smokehouse, its pens, its flue, its workers, its records, and its remaining stock would all be examined where the work had been done. Lord Arthur Vance arrived before the military wagons. He came in a closed carriage with 2 clerks, and no visible sign of haste. Vale remained under military guard at the malt yard. Vance stepped down in a dark coat despite the heat, and looked once at the workers gathered behind the gate. Then he looked at Sarah. "You have mistaken improper storage for evidence against my contract," he said. Sarah stood beside the weighing table. Beneath a clean cloth lay the Blackwood batch books, Ward's certificates, the road copies, the altered crate list, and Vance's instruction to keep the storehouse vents closed. "I have made no conclusion," she said. "No. You have allowed frightened people to make it for you." Captain Bell entered before she answered. Dr. Ward followed with the magistrate, 2 quartermasters, 6 soldiers, and the driver who had witnessed the mixed shipment. Bell addressed everyone in the yard. "Today we will determine whether Blackwood can supply the regiment safely, consistently, and at the promised scale. We will also compare its process and records with goods delivered under the Duke's existing contract." Vance removed his gloves, 1 finger at a time. "My contract has passed previous examinations." Ward set his case on the table. Not the meat found beneath altered Blackwood markings. The Duke did not answer. The inspection began with the herd. Ward selected animals without warning. He examined mouths, hooves, joints, wounds, breathing, and temperature. The pigs remained lean, but their hides had improved, and their ribs no longer stood as sharply as they had on the day of transfer. No animal showed the contagious disease named in Vance's declaration. The quartermaster entered the result. Sarah then brought forward the original receipt. Her marginal sentence remained clear beneath Bell's earlier signature. No disease examination witnessed. No inspecting surgeon named. Ward placed his own findings beside it. The herd had not been diagnosed before Sarah received it. The legal warning used to attach intent to her had been written without medical evidence. Vance watched the papers but offered no objection. Next came the slaughter floor. Sarah followed the same order used every morning. Hands washed. Tools boiled. Animal number assigned. Starting weight recorded. Dirty and clean zones separated. Thomas called the figures. Mrs. Hale entered them. A quartermaster tested Blackwood's scale against army weights brought from the depot. The difference was less than half an ounce. Vance stepped toward the chalk line. Daniel raised the scrub brush. "You must wash first, Your Grace." The yard became silent. Vance looked at Sarah. "Is this performance necessary?" "It is the same rule," Captain Bell followed. Bell washed again and crossed the line. The Duke stood still for several seconds. Then he placed his gloves on the table, washed his hands, and entered. No one smiled. The work continued. At the fire mouth, Thomas inspected the fuel without Sarah's help. He rejected one block containing green sedge, approved the remaining peat, and mixed 4 measures of deep-cut fuel with 1 measure of oak. Pike checked the beam straps. Mrs. Hale verified the bone tags. Daniel inspected every bucket crossing the clean line. Sarah placed fresh beeswax on the 4 heat points and released the batch into their control. Warm smoke entered the buried flue. At the tower opening, Ward measured it again. Cool above. Stable draft. No softened wax. The figures were written by separate hands. While the demonstration batch smoked, Bell ordered the detained goods opened in the yard. Blackwood's crates came first. Each carried the depot code, Ward's red seal, and Pike's diagonal lid mark. Each cut inside carried an individual bone tag matching a recorded animal, starting weight, smoking time, tower position, and retained sample. Then the quartermasters opened Vance's crates. The outer boards bore the black crown and painted V. Inside, the meat had been packed by crate rather than by animal. No individual tags identified the cuts. Vance's senior clerk opened a leather ledger. The quantities are recorded by shipment. Not by carcass, Thomas said. Vance turned toward him. You are not an officer of this inquiry, Bell answered without looking up. He is Blackwood's registered operations witness. Ward selected 1 cut from Vance's 3rd crate. Its exterior was dry beneath a heavy coat of salt. Near the bone, the knife opened a soft pocket with a sour odor. A 2nd cut showed the same defect. The outer surface had been hardened by hot smoke, while moisture remained trapped inside. Sarah placed 1 Blackwood cut beside it. The quartermaster weighed both. Then Ward opened both through the center. Blackwood's pork had dried evenly. Vance's had used more than 3 times the salt, while losing less moisture. Bell ordered Vale's seized document case brought forward. Inside were revised crate lists, salt allotments, payment approvals, and 3 letters in Vance's hand. The first reduced the quality allowed in Army meat, while continuing to charge the higher grade. The second ordered estate salt merchants to refuse Blackwood until after its first inspection. The third instructed Vale to preserve Sarah's original transfer declaration, including the sentence claiming she had knowingly accepted infected stock. Bell read the final line twice. You intended the declaration to be used against her? Vance's expression remained controlled. I intended liability to remain where the transfer placed it. Ward set the storehouse instruction beside the letters. You also ordered ventilation closed around mixed shipments. I protected an existing agreement from an unlicensed supplier. You created the conditions likely to spoil the detained meat, Bell said. Vance looked toward the papers. He did not deny the handwriting. Sarah placed the road copy, retained samples, altered lid mark, driver's statement, and original receipt into 1 line across the table. The sequence required no speech. She had received an undiagnosed herd under a declaration prepared to imply intent. Blackwood's meat had left under recorded weights and seals. Vance's goods had entered the same building afterward. 1 Blackwood lid had been removed. Untagged meat from his process had been placed beneath her markings. The vents had been closed under his written order. The loss had already been assigned to her transfer liability before the meat spoiled. The accusation and the manufactured failure belonged to the same plan. By midday, the demonstration batch completed its first stage. Ward checked the wax. The quartermasters reweighed the 6 cuts. Their moisture loss fell within the range recorded across the previous 9 accepted batches. Bell entered the final comparison on the inspection board. Blackwood had completed 9 consecutive compliant batches. Its average salt use stood at 31% of the quantity charged under Vance's contract. No Blackwood batch had shown internal spoilage before seizure. 4 of 6 recent cuts supplied under Vance's mark had softened near the bone despite heavier curing. The Army was not choosing between 2 opinions. It was choosing between a traceable system and an untraceable one, between a process that another worker could repeat and a contract that depended on no one cutting too deeply into the meat or the accounts. Bell closed Vance's ledger. Your military supply contract is suspended immediately. The board will determine repayment, disqualification, and criminal referral. Then he turned towards Sarah. Blackwood will complete the regiment's order under direct military inspection. Its original transfer deed will remain in force pending the ownership ruling. The workers did not cheer. Thomas returned to the fire. Mrs. Hale checked the next wage entry. Pike tested the loaded beam. Daniel washed the knife Ward had used. Sarah placed the soot-black key beside Bell's official seal. Vance still possessed his title, his estate, and the carriage waiting beyond the gate. What he no longer possessed was the power to make his version of events sufficient. Inside Blackwood, every weight, mark, witness, and repeated batch now said otherwise. The ruling was read at Blackwood 3 mornings later, exactly 4 weeks after the soot-black key struck Sarah Miller's palm. Captain Bell stood beneath the open tower door, with the board's order in both hands. The workers gathered in the yard before the first fire was lit. No one had been instructed to stop, but the cutting tables remained empty, the peat pans cold, and even the pigs shifted more quietly in their pens. Lord Arthur Vance arrived without veil. He stepped from his carriage, in the same dark coat he had worn at the inspection. The morning was cooler than the day he had transferred Blackwood, but he carried no gloves. His title still brought a carriage, servants, and land enough to surround the smokehouse on 3 sides. It no longer brought silence. Bell opened the ruling. The Duke's military supply contract was terminated. Payments connected to false grading, relabeled shipments, and meat charged to the army after being recorded as destroyed would be recovered from his estate. His authority over military supply in the county was revoked, pending further proceedings. The salt leases used to obstruct Blackwood would be open to independent review. Bell did not pause before the next section. The original transfer deed, executed by Lord Arthur Vance, was confirmed as a permanent conveyance of Blackwood Smokehouse, its fixed equipment, pens, and remaining herd to Sarah Miller. The estate could not reclaim the property through her father's debts, her cottage lease, or any later cancellation of Vance's private agreements. A sound moved through the workers, not a cheer, only a breath released by many people at once. Blackwood received a 1-year military supply contract, renewable after independent inspection. The northern spring pipe and western road easement were attached permanently to the smokehouse deed, rather than to the Army agreement. The peat beds bordering the western flue were placed under perpetual cutting rights held by 3 trustees, Sarah Miller, Thomas Reed, and 1 representative elected each year by registered Blackwood workers. When Bell finished, Sarah asked the first question that mattered. When will the spring be opened? It was opened at dawn. And payment for the accepted shipment? Released this morning. Mrs. Hale opened the wage ledger. That movement changed the yard more than the ruling had. Sarah had divided the expected payment before any coin arrived. Workers would receive wages for the unpaid days, not only meat credit. Pike would be paid for the ash braces, iron straps, and repaired rails. Families who had supplied whey, bran, peat, clean scraps, and carts would be reimbursed by recorded weight. A reserve would purchase covered troughs, slate for the north roof, and a copper vessel large enough to boil knives and cloth without wasting half a morning's fuel. The remainder would stay in Blackwood's operating account. No single household, including Sarah's, could withdraw it without 2 trustee signatures. Vance had built his contract so every decision narrowed toward one name. Sarah built Blackwood so no single name could quietly empty it. Thomas approached with the final production board beneath his remaining arm. The regiment's order had closed at 1,216 pounds, 16 above the promised weight. 9 consecutive batches had passed inspection. Blackwood's average salt use stood at 31% of the quantity charged under Vance's contract. 32 people had received wages or food credit during the 4 weeks. 178 pigs remained alive, gaining weight, and free of contagious disease. 4 families threatened with eviction now held paid work, protected by the road and peat rights. Those numbers did not describe wealth. They described survival that could be counted. The army wagons arrived before noon. Each crate was inspected, weighed, sealed, and matched to its batch list. Ward selected the final retained samples. A quartermaster checked the depot codes. Thomas compared Pike's diagonal lid marks with the road copies. No one hurried because the regiment sailed the following morning. The process existed precisely because deadlines made care easier to abandon. Sarah watched the last crate close. The soldiers would leave with the full order. No speech could improve that fact. Bell waited until the wagons had been drawn beyond the gate before turning to Thomas. The board reviewed the yard discipline and chain of custody method, he said. The organization follows military practice. Thomas stood with his pinned sleeve toward the tower. You will be registered as Blackwood's Superintendent of Operations. You will have authority to stop any military batch that fails the written standard. Thomas looked at Sarah. The authority applies if Miss Miller orders the batch released. Sarah answered before Bell could. Especially then. Thomas lowered his head once. I accept. The recognition did not restore his arm, or return the years after the army dismissed him. It did restore the value of what he knew. The same discipline Vance had called useless now stood inside the official contract. Only after the wagons disappeared did Sarah turn toward the Duke. He remained beyond the chalked boundary. His carriage waited on the road. No clerk stood behind him. No steward held the papers. The documents that mattered were spread on the cutting table. Sarah's original transfer receipt, Ward's medical findings, the road copies, the altered crate record, the instruction to close the storehouse vents, and the 3 letters taken from Vale's case. You asked me to attend, Vance said. I asked the former contract holder to witness the final transfer. Sarah placed the original deed beside the board's ruling. You declared the herd diseased without examination. You cut water, salt, fuel, labor, and road access. Your meat was placed beneath Blackwood's markings. You ordered the storehouse closed and prepared to use my signature as proof that I acted knowingly. Vance looked at the documents. Bell remained within hearing distance. So did the workers. At length, the Duke spoke. I approved inferior meat at the higher contract price. His voice remained controlled. I ordered merchants under my leases to refuse Blackwood. I signed the instruction to close the storehouse vents, knowing the heat could damage the detained shipment. I expected the transfer declaration to place criminal liability on you. No one moved. The admission was no longer required to prove the case. That was what gave it weight. I believed rank would determine whose account was accepted, Vance continued. I believed your lack of standing made you safe to sacrifice. Sarah waited. He looked toward the tower, where the vents stood open and clean. I was wrong. The words did not restore wages, remove fear from the village, or return the animals lost to neglect. Sarah did not thank him. Changed conduct required material cost. Vance placed 2 signed documents beside the ruling. The first released every remaining claim against Sarah's cottage and her father's workshop debt. The second restored bridge access to village carts and canceled the estate penalties imposed on families who had worked at Blackwood. Sarah read both pages line by line. Your grazing notices against the peat cutters? Withdrawn. The firewood penalties? Withdrawn. The winter rent extensions? Restored. She handed the pages to Bell for witness. Only then did she sign the final army receipt. By autumn, Blackwood employed 41 people. The upper hooks had been replaced, though Sarah kept one rusted hook fixed beside the entrance. It reminded every new worker what neglect looked like before people began calling it inevitable. The spring fed 2 covered cisterns. Slate protected the weakest pens. Deep-cut peat carried most of the fire, with oak used sparingly for ignition, balance, and flavor. Each batch still carried an animal number, a starting weight, a smoking time, and 3 signatures. The process did not become looser because the danger had passed. It became easier for more people to follow. Sarah no longer inspected every bucket herself. Daniel trained new workers at the chalk line. Pike certified the beams and rails. Mrs. Hale controlled supplies and wages. Thomas could stop a batch without waiting for permission. Sarah retained the final release standard. She no longer mistook that responsibility for the need to control every hand. On the first cold morning of October, she stood beneath the tower while Thomas checked a new crew. Smoke rose through the upper vents in one pale, even column. Outside the gate, carts waited from 3 villages that had once refused to approach the road. Sarah took the soot-black key from her pocket. The iron was no cleaner than it had been 4 weeks earlier. Black dust still remained in the grooves around the bow. She placed it in Thomas's hand. "This opens the outer gate and the fire room," she said. "The record cupboard has a separate key." He closed his fingers around it. Because trust requires limits? Because no operation should depend on one person being believed. Thomas looked toward the workers moving through the marked stations. Then he fixed the key to the ring at his belt. Above them, inspected meat hung in cool smoke. Beneath their feet, the buried flue carried the heat away through earth the Duke had considered worthless. One original crack remained visible in the western wall, sealed but not hidden. Blackwood no longer depended on Vance's permission, his contract, or his version of events. The deed belonged to Sarah. The operating authority was shared. The evidence belonged to anyone willing to check it. The key had first arrived as a sentence. Now it opened something designed to outlast the person holding it.